5, 4, 3, 2, 1, start. Studio microphone. Constantinople. The city that refused to fall. For centuries, the city known as Constantinople was not just a city. It was an idea, it was a dream, and for many, it was a challenge sent by history itself. Built where Europe meets Asia, standing between two worlds, Constantinople was more than stone and walls. It was the key to continents. And whoever controlled it, controlled history. Global world in chaos, a city standing alone. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Europe collapsed into darkness. Cities were burned, roads disappeared, kings fell one after another. Barbarian tribes marched freely across Europe, destroying everything in their path. Civilization itself seemed to be dying, but while Europe fell into chaos, Constantinople stood untouched. While the West collapsed, Constantinople survived. This city became the last strong light of the ancient Roman world. Shield walls that defied time. One reason for this survival was its legendary defense. The Theodosian walls were not ordinary walls. They were massive. They were layered. They were designed to break armies. For nearly 1,000 years, these walls stopped every enemy who stood before them. Many attackers believed they would conquer the city in days. Most of them never even reached the gates. Fire, Greek fire, the flame of fear. But walls alone were not enough. Constantinople possessed a secret weapon, a weapon so terrifying that enemies spoke of it in fear. Greek fire, a flame that burned on water, a fire that ships could not escape, a weapon that turned seas into nightmares. Enemy fleets that came close were destroyed before they understood what hit them. As long as Greek fire existed, the city felt protected by destiny itself. Crossed swords, centuries of failed attacks. For hundreds of years, armies came. The Arabs came, the Bulgarians came, the Rus armies came by sea. Even powerful European forces tried. They surrounded the city. They starved outside the walls. They attacked again and again. And every time, Constantinople survived. People began to believe something powerful. This city cannot be conquered. Warning: the greatest betrayal, 1204. But history has a cruel sense of irony. The city that could not be taken by enemies was broken by allies. In the year 1204, European Christian armies known as the Crusaders stood outside Constantinople. They were not supposed to attack the city. They were supposed to protect it. Instead, they betrayed it. They stormed the walls. They looted churches. They destroyed homes. They stole treasures collected over centuries. For the first time in its history, Constantinople fell, not to outsiders, but to betrayal from within its own faith. This moment changed everything. Candle, a city that never fully recovered. Although the city was later reclaimed, the damage was already done. The population dropped. The economy collapsed. The army weakened. Constantinople still looked powerful, but inside, it was bleeding. It was no longer the unstoppable giant it once was. It had become a shadow of its former self. Crescent moon, a new power watches from the east. While Constantinople weakened, a new force was rising quietly in Anatolia. The Ottoman Turks, young, organized, hungry for expansion. Unlike old armies, they embraced new technology. They mastered gunpowder. They built massive cannons. And slowly, step by step, they surrounded Constantinople from all sides. The city was now isolated, a piece of the ancient world trapped in a new age. Crossed swords, the young conqueror, Mehmed II. In 1453, a young ruler took the Ottoman throne. His name was Mehmed II. He was only 21 years old. Many underestimated him because of his age. But Mehmed had one obsession, one dream, one goal: to conquer Constantinople. He believed that history had chosen him. Bomb cannons versus walls. Mehmed did what no one before him had done. He built giant cannons, some so large they shocked the world. Day after day, night after night, the walls were bombarded. Walls that had survived for 1,000 years began to crack. The impossible was finally becoming possible. Candle, the final hours. Inside the city, defenders fought with courage. They knew help was not coming. They knew this was the end. Yet they stood their ground. On May 29, 1453, after weeks of relentless attack, Constantinople finally fell. The city that had resisted the world had reached the end of its journey. Globe the day history changed forever. The fall of Constantinople was not just a military event, it was a global turning point. The Byzantine Empire ended. The Middle Ages came to a close. A new world began. Scholars fled to Europe, bringing ancient knowledge with them, sparking the Renaissance. One city fell, and the modern world began. Mosque from Constantinople to Istanbul. Mehmed II entered the city not as a destroyer, but as a ruler who understood its importance. He protected its people. He restored its buildings. He made it the capital of the Ottoman Empire. Over time, cultures blended. Faiths coexisted. Architecture transformed the skyline. And slowly, naturally, the city became known as Istanbul. A city reborn. Constantinople did not fall because it was weak. It fell because time moved forward. And when it fell, the world was never the same again. After the city was reborn as Istanbul, it did not rest. It transformed. Mehmed II understood something few conquerors ever did. Cities don't survive on victory alone, they survive on purpose. So he rebuilt not just walls, but identity. Markets reopened, trade routes returned, scholars, architects, and merchants arrived from every direction. Istanbul stopped being a conquered city and became a center of gravity. The Ottoman Empire now had a heart. Globe Istanbul becomes the world's crossroads. Within decades, Istanbul was no longer just powerful. It was essential. Europe needed it for trade. Asia passed through it for commerce. Africa reached it by sea. Silk, spices, gold, ideas, all of them moved through Istanbul. Mosques rose beside churches. Synagogues stood within walking distance of palaces. This wasn't tolerance out of kindness. It was tolerance by design. The Ottomans understood that diversity made the empire richer, financially and intellectually. Scholars still argue whether this multicultural system was idealistic or purely practical, but the result was undeniable. Istanbul became one of the greatest cities on earth. Crossed swords, the age of expansion. After Mehmed II, the empire did what empires do best. It expanded. Under rulers like Selim I and Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottomans conquered vast lands. The Balkans, the Middle East, North Africa. At its height, the Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents. And Istanbul sat at the center of it all, a city where decisions reshaped the world. This was not just military power. It was legal reform, architecture, and administration. Suleiman wasn't called the Magnificent only for his wars, but for his laws. Laws that brought order to diversity. Rules that allowed different peoples to live under one empire. Mantelpiece clock when power begins to slow. But empires, like cities, age. By the 17th century, the world began changing faster than the Ottomans could adapt. Europe industrialized. New trade routes bypassed Istanbul. Technology shifted the balance of power. The empire still looked strong, but cracks had begun to form. Corruption crept in. Military reforms lagged behind Europe. Internal revolts weakened control. Istanbul remained beautiful, but beauty alone doesn't stop decline. Scholars still debate whether the Ottoman decline was inevitable or simply mismanaged, but history agrees on one thing. The empire was falling behind a world that no longer waited. Globe the empire becomes the sick man. By the 19th century, Europe gave the Ottoman Empire a cruel nickname, the sick man of Europe. Territories were lost. Foreign powers interfered. Debt chained the empire's future. Istanbul was still alive, but now it carried the weight of survival, not dominance. Reforms were attempted. Western ideas entered politics. Education changed, but change came too slowly. The old empire could not hold the new world. Collision World War I, the breaking point. When World War I erupted, the Ottoman Empire chose a side. And it chose wrong. The war drained its strength. Its lands were occupied. Its future was dismantled on paper by foreign powers. Istanbul itself was occupied by Allied forces. For the first time since 1453, the city was no longer fully in Turkish hands. It felt like history was repeating, but without hope. Sunrise, the birth of modern Turkey. Out of that collapse, a new figure emerged. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. He rejected the old empire. He rejected foreign control. He rejected the past, not out of hatred, but out of necessity. Through war and resistance, a new nation was born in 1923. The Republic of Turkey. The capital moved to Ankara, but Istanbul remained the soul. A city shaped by empires, now belonging to a nation. Mosque Istanbul today. A living timeline. Today, Istanbul is not frozen in history. It breathes. You can walk past Roman walls, Ottoman mosques, Byzantine churches, and modern skyscrapers, all in one day. Few cities tell their story so openly. Few cities have died and returned so many times. Istanbul was never just conquered. It was transformed. And every time history tried to end it, the city simply became something new. After the Republic of Turkey was born, the country did not celebrate for long. Because building a nation is harder than winning a war. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk understood this. He knew that Turkey could not survive by living in the shadow of empires. So he did something radical. He turned the country away from the past and forced it to face the future. Sunrise, a nation rewritten. The Ottoman Caliphate was abolished. Not gently, not slowly, but decisively. Religion was separated from the state. Western laws replaced old imperial systems. The Arabic script was abandoned for Latin letters. People woke up in a country that looked familiar but felt completely new. For many, it was liberation. For others, it felt like losing a piece of their soul. Scholars still argue whether Ataturk saved Turkey or severed it from its roots. But history agrees on one thing. Turkey survived because it changed. Mosque Istanbul watches in silence. Even though Ankara became the capital, Istanbul never lost its gravity. It was no longer the political heart, but it remained the cultural conscience. The city watched reforms unfold from a distance. Minarets still pierced the skyline. Church bells still rang quietly. The Bosphorus still carried ships between continents. Istanbul didn't argue with the future. It adapted, balanced scale between east and west. Turkey now stood where it always had, between worlds. Not just geographically, but mentally. Europe pulled it westward. History pulled it eastward. Modernity demanded speed. Tradition demanded patience. This tension never disappeared. It became Turkey's identity. Globe Cold War shadows. As the world split into rival camps, Turkey chose alignment. It joined NATO. It became a strategic bridge between the West and the Soviet sphere. This brought protection. It also brought pressure. Coups followed. Governments rose and fell. Democracy stumbled, recovered, and stumbled again. Through it all, Turkey remained intact. Bent, but unbroken. Mantelpiece clock, the late 20th century. Restlessness. Cities expanded rapidly. Villages emptied into urban life. Young people dreamed of Europe. Old generations clung to memory. Istanbul grew chaotic, messy, alive. Traffic replaced caravans. Apartments replaced wooden houses. But history never vanished. It simply hid behind concrete. Crescent Moon, the 21st century awakening. In the new millennium, Turkey began to redefine itself again. Economically stronger, politically louder, culturally confident. Debates returned, about identity, religion, freedom, power. Turkey was no longer asking, who are we? It was asking, who decides who we are? And Istanbul stood at the center of every question. Mosque Istanbul today, not a museum. Modern Istanbul is not preserved. It evolves. You can drink coffee where emperors once planned wars. You can hear multiple languages on the same street. You can feel centuries under your feet without ever seeing them. This city doesn't tell you its story loudly. It waits for you to listen. You begin to realize something quiet but important about Turkey. It never truly settles. Every generation inherits a country that is still deciding what it wants to be. And Istanbul feels this more than anywhere else. City at dusk, a city that carries contradictions. By the early 2000s, Istanbul is louder than it has ever been. Construction cranes rise beside ancient domes. Glass towers reflect minarets. History doesn't disappear, it competes. You walk through neighborhoods where tradition is firm, then turn a corner and step into cafes that feel unmistakably European. This isn't confusion, this is coexistence under tension. Scholars still argue whether Turkey's strength lies in this balance or whether the balance itself is the source of endless friction. But from the street level, it feels like momentum. Ballot box with ballot power, voice, and the question of direction. Politics becomes personal again, not abstract, not distant. People argue in homes, cafes, taxis. What does modern mean? What does religious mean? Who gets to define the future? Turkey's voice grows stronger on the world stage. Sometimes admired, sometimes criticized, but no longer ignored, and Istanbul becomes the stage where every argument is visible. Every protest, every celebration, every silence. Night bridges sides. Through all of this, the Bosphorus keeps flowing. Ships move between continents without caring about ideology. Europe and Asia remain connected by water, bridges, and routine. This is one of Istanbul's quiet lessons. Politics change faster than geography. Empires fall, governments shift, but the land keeps asking humans to cooperate. Dove crises, resilience, and memory. There are hard moments, economic strain, earthquakes, regional conflicts spilling emotional weight across borders. Each time, people worry, is this the breaking point? And each time, Turkey bends instead of snapping. Istanbul absorbs shock the way it always has, through adaptation. Businesses reopen, life resumes, history layers another scar without collapsing. Oddly enough, this resilience doesn't come from optimism. It comes from memory. A city that has survived sieges, occupations, fires, and revolutions doesn't panic easily. Globe Turkey in the world today. Today, Turkey stands in a familiar position. Important, strategic, argued over. A bridge again, between cultures, alliances, and narratives. Some see opportunity, some see uncertainty. Both are correct. Scholars still argue whether Turkey's future lies in deeper integration or deliberate independence. But from within, it feels less like a choice and more like a balancing act that never ends. Mosque Istanbul at night. At night, Istanbul softens. The noise lowers. Lights reflect off water. Calls to prayer echo gently instead of urgently. This is when the city feels honest. Not powerful, not political, just old, and alive. You realize that Istanbul doesn't try to prove anything anymore. It has already been Rome. Already been Constantinople. Already been the Ottoman heart. Already been reborn as part of a republic. Now, it simply exists. Crescent moon quiet reflection, slowing down. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the layers. Footsteps of soldiers who never return. Prayers whispered in different languages. Decisions made in rooms that no longer exist. Few places on earth remember this much. Few still remain standing. And as the city settles into the late hours, you begin to sense something that history books never explain properly. Turkey isn't loud about its past anymore. It carries it quietly. Crescent moon when history stops playing. There comes a moment, usually late at night, when Istanbul stops trying to be impressive. Tourists thin out. Streets exhale. The city's edges soften. You realize that Istanbul no longer needs to prove that it was important. It already knows. Empires once fought to own this place. Now people simply live in it. That might be the greatest transformation of all. Compass a country that learned patience. Modern Turkey has learned something difficult. Not how to win, not how to dominate, but how to wait. After centuries of expansion, collapse, rebirth, and reinvention, the country understands cycles. When the world pushes, Turkey pauses. When the world rushes, Turkey recalculates. Scholars still argue whether this patience is strategy or exhaustion, but from inside, it feels like experience. Experience earned the hard way. Wave the Bosphorus as memory. Stand near the Bosphorus long enough, and you start noticing what never changed. Water keeps moving, ships keep passing, trade keeps flowing. Romans used it, Byzantines guarded it, Ottomans ruled it, modern Turkey regulates it. Different hands, same current. The Bosphorus doesn't care about flags. It remembers movement, not ownership. Dove ordinary lives, extraordinary ground. This is what often gets missed. Most of Turkey's story today isn't written by leaders or speeches. It's written by ordinary people. By shopkeepers opening early. By families arguing over dinner. By students planning futures that may not look like the past. They walk over layers of empire without stopping to name them. History becomes background noise, and that's a sign of ruin. Sleep, it drifts. At night, Istanbul doesn't sleep the way other cities do. It drifts. Lights flicker instead of shutting off. Sounds fade but don't disappear. The city feels like it's remembering something without needing to say it out loud. You can sit by the water and feel both very small and strangely safe. Few places give you that combination. Candle, a thought that lingers. Maybe the real story of Turkey isn't about conquest or collapse. Maybe it's about continuity, about staying present while the world keeps demanding change, about carrying contradiction without letting it tear you apart. That's not weakness, that's endurance. And now, as the city finally quiets down, you let the story rest. Istanbul doesn't ask you to remember every empire. It doesn't demand that you choose a side of history. It simply invites you to sit with it, to listen to the water, to feel the air move between continents, to understand that this city has survived not by holding on tightly, but by letting time pass through it. Rome tried to define it. Empires tried to own it. Nations tried to reshape it. And yet, Istanbul remains. Not frozen, not finished, just present. Maybe that's the lesson Turkey leaves you with tonight. That identity can be layered. That history can be heavy without being loud. And that survival doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes, survival looks like continuity. So as the lights fade and the city settles into its familiar rhythm, you let the story drift away. No urgency, no conclusions forced, just a city breathing, and you, quietly listening. Sleep well, history will still be there tomorrow. End of story. Crescent moon.